So we need to talk about imaginary numbers. Remember in class we've discussed the square root and how to simplify square roots. So for example, if I have, let's just say, square root of 62, what I'm going to do, or actually let me change that to a 63. Well, that's the same thing as 9 times 7. And I can take the square root of a 9, because the square root of 9 is 3, and get 3 square root of 7. And so I've simplified this radical. Well, sometimes we end up with a negative sign underneath the radical. And if you try to put it in your calculator, you're going to get a syntax error, which means it's not a real number. So what happens is we introduce this imaginary number system, where the square root of a -1 always becomes this I, this imaginary number. We can square I squared, and get a -1. So if you notice that the square root of -b is equal to I times the square root of b. So let's look at simplifying a few of these. So I know that 100, the square root of this, let's just go ahead and rewrite this as 100 times a -1. Well, the square root of 100 is 10. The square root of the -1 is I. So I get 10I. Same thing happens with the square root of a -36. That's 36 times a -1. The square root of 36 is 6, and the square root of -1 is I. Now sometimes they don't simplify down into perfect squares. So thinking about this, square root of -6, that's 6 times a -1. Well, I can't take the square root of 6, but I can of the -1. Square root of -1 is I, and I leave the 6 underneath the radical. Same thing happens with the square root of -21. That's a 21 times a -1. So the square root of -1 is I. 21, I can't take the perfect square of that, so I'm going to leave it underneath. A hint here, if you ever have square roots and there's a negative underneath there, take that negative sign out and make an I in the front. So my suggestion is practice some of the imaginary numbers, simplifying them, and then let me know if you have any questions.